Emily Harper slammed the letter down on the schoolhouse desk so hard the inkwell rattled. "You want me gone?" she said, her voice steady even as her hands shook. "Fine. But before I walk out of Cedar Ridge, every person in this valley is going to know exactly what you did to them." The man across from her smiled the way powerful men smile when they believe they've already won. He had no idea what she was carrying in that leather satchel, and he had no idea who was standing 50 yards away, watching through the window. If this story already has you hooked, subscribe to our channel, stay with us until the very end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The stagecoach pulled into Cedar Ridge on a Tuesday afternoon in late July, 1887, carrying 3 passengers, a mail sack, and 1 woman who had learned the hard way that starting over was not a choice. It was a survival skill. Emily Harper stepped off that coach with a worn leather suitcase, a small trunk of books, and the expression that told anyone watching she was not here to make friends. She was here to work. She was here to disappear into purpose and forget everything that had been taken from her back in Cheyenne. She was 28 years old and already felt ancient. "You the new school teacher?" A boy couldn't have been more than 10 was squinting up at her from beside the water trough, chewing on a piece of dry grass. "That depends," Emily said. "Is there a school?" The boy grinned. "Barely." That was Cedar Ridge in a single word. Barely a school. Barely a town. Barely enough rain in summer to keep the creek from running dry, but enough people scraping out a living in those mountains that someone had finally decided their children deserved to read and write, and maybe dream a little bigger than their father's fences. Emily had answered the advertisement in the Cheyenne Gazette 3 weeks after the bank sold off the last piece of Harper land. 22 acres her father had broken his back over for 19 years. Gone in a single morning's paperwork. She hadn't cried at the auction. She had stood in the back of the crowd and watched strangers bid on her childhood, and when the gavel came down, she turned and walked away and started making different plans. Teaching was the plan. Cedar Ridge was the plan. Distance was the plan. She told herself she wasn't running. She was choosing. The distinction mattered less and less the further the stagecoach climbed into the mountains. The woman who met her at the schoolhouse steps was named Ruth Calloway, the wife of a cattle rancher, round-faced and practical, with the kind of tired eyes that came from too many years of watching things go wrong and not being surprised anymore. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge," Ruth said, handing Emily a key that looked like it hadn't been polished since the reconstruction. "I'll warn you now, the roof leaks on the north end, the floorboards near the window are soft, and 2 of the desks have broken legs we've been meaning to fix for 6 months. "I've taught in worse," Emily said. It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. Ruth looked at her for a moment, with those tired eyes, seemed to decide something and said, "Come to supper tonight. My husband Tom will want to meet you. Half the valley will want to meet you, actually. We haven't had a proper teacher in 14 months. "What happened to the last one?" Ruth's expression shifted just slightly, just enough. "He left. Decided Cedar Ridge wasn't the right fit for him." Emily picked up her suitcase. "I'm a harder fit to discourage than most." Ruth almost smiled. "I hope that's true." Supper at the Calloway Ranch introduced Emily to the arithmetic of Cedar Ridge, the invisible math that ran underneath every conversation. There were 7 ranching families at that table, and within an hour, Emily had worked out that 4 of them were behind on payments to a man named Gerald Pruitt, who operated the valley's only lending office out of a building attached to the general store. 2 more were in disputes over grazing rights on land that had recently changed hands in ways none of them fully understood. The 7th family, a young couple named the Hendersons, who'd arrived from Nebraska 2 years ago, had already lost 40 acres and weren't sure they'd keep the rest through winter. Nobody said any of this plainly. They talked around it. They spoke in the language of people who have learned that saying certain things out loud in the wrong company can cost you. But Emily had grown up on a ranch. She knew how to listen to what wasn't being said. "Who owns the valley land?" she asked during a pause in the conversation that had suddenly gone careful. The larger parcels, who holds the deeds? The table went quiet in a way that felt different from ordinary quiet. Tom Calloway cleared his throat. Most of the acreage up the mountain runs under a few names. Walker Land is the largest holding. Cedar Ridge Valley Company out of Helena controls several parcels. Pruitt has his share of liens. He looked at his plate. It gets complicated. It always does, Emily said. She looked around this table at these people, their weathered hands, their careful faces, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not pity, something closer to recognition. She knew what it felt like to sit at a table and understand that the land under your feet might not be yours much longer. She didn't say that, but she remembered it. 3 days into her tenure, Emily's wagon lost a wheel on the mountain road coming back from collecting borrowed books from a family 6 miles up the valley. She was good with a horse and better with a map, but a split-wheel hub on a narrow road with a storm coming in off the peaks was nobody's idea of manageable. The wind had teeth. The sky had gone the color of a bruise. She had tied her horse to a tree, turned her collar up, and was calculating how badly the books would suffer if she had to walk the rest of the way in the rain when she heard the sound of hooves approaching from higher up the trail. The man who came around the bend was on a gray horse and leading a pack mule. He was tall and the saddle broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that spent most of its time outdoors and kept its expressions to itself. He looked at the wagon. He looked at her. He did not look alarmed or put upon or particularly surprised, which Emily appreciated. "Wheel hub," she said before he could ask. He swung down from the horse without a word and walked over to look at the damage. He crouched beside it, ran his fingers along the split wood, stood back up. "Have a spare?" he asked. "I do not." He nodded as though this was merely information to be worked with rather than a problem to be lamented, and went to his pack mule. He spent the next 40 minutes doing the kind of mechanical work that Emily associated with men who had learned to fix things, because there was never anyone else around to do it. Methodical, efficient, unhurried, despite the building storm. He spoke only when there was something useful to say. He didn't fill silence with pleasantries. Emily handed him tools when he gestured for them, held the lantern when the light failed, and did not pretend she needed to be thanked for helping with her own wagon repair. "You're the new teacher," he said at one point, not a question. "Emily Harper." He paused for a single moment, so brief she nearly missed it. "Caleb Walker." She processed the name. Walker Land. Tom Calloway had mentioned it at supper. "You live up the mountain?" she asked. "Some ways up, yes." "Ranch hand." Another pause, shorter this time. "Something like that." The wheel was fixed by the time the first serious rain hit. He helped her load the books back into the wagon, checked the axle once more, and stepped back. "Road gets slippery past the fork," he said. "Stay to the right side." "Thank you, Mr. Walker." He touched the brim of his hat, the exact minimum gesture that courtesy required, and mounted his horse, and rode back up into the storm without another word. Emily drove home through the rain, thinking that was the strangest conversation she'd had in years, and the most comfortable. She told Ruth Calloway about it the next morning over coffee in Ruth's kitchen. Ruth set down her cup very deliberately. "Caleb Walker," she said. "He fixed my wheel. Barely said 10 words the whole time. Is he—" Emily searched for the right description. "Does he work the upper range? He mentioned he lived up the mountain." "He lives up there, yes." Ruth was looking at her in that particular way again. Careful. Measuring. "He keeps to himself mostly. Helps people out when they need it. Doesn't talk about himself much." He seemed— Emily paused. "Competent. Unusually so." "He is that." Ruth picked her cup back up, took a slow sip. "Just be careful around the men in this valley, Emily. Not every person here is what they look like on the surface. Some are better. Some are considerably worse." Emily wasn't sure which category Caleb Walker fell into, but she found herself thinking about the way he'd fixed the wheel, No wasted movement, no need for acknowledgement, and decided that a man who helped someone in a storm without wanting anything for it was probably at least worth knowing. She was right about that. What she was wrong about was almost everything else. Her first month in the schoolhouse rebuilt something in her she thought Cheyenne had permanently damaged. She had 11 students ranging from 6 to 14, and they were to a child starved for someone who took them seriously. She gave them mathematics not as rote repetition, but as problems rooted in land-cattle-weather commerce. She gave them reading that had weight to it. She stayed late 3 afternoons a week for children whose home situations made quiet study impossible. The parents noticed. They started bringing things: jars of preserves, cut firewood, a new length of curtain fabric for the schoolhouse window. Cedar Ridge was offering what it had, which was not money, but was genuine. She loved it more than she'd expected to. And underneath that love, running quiet as a mountain creek in dry season, was the other thing she was noticing: the arithmetic of fear that governed this valley. The Hendersons lost their last northern pasture in week 3. Signed under what Tom Calloway described afterward, when he thought Emily was out of earshot, as a contract that didn't look anything like what young Marcus Henderson thought he was agreeing to. Old Pete Garrow, who ran sheep on the eastern ridge, got a notice that his grazing permit had been revoked, a permit he'd held for 11 years, because someone in Helena had reclassified the land. The widow Margaret Sears had a man show up at her door with a lien document claiming her husband had borrowed money from Pruitt's office before he died. She had never seen the document. She had no memory of any such loan. But there it was, with what looked like her husband's signature on it. Emily began keeping notes. Not because she had any plan yet, just because she was the kind of woman who wrote things down when they didn't add up, and nothing in Cedar Ridge was adding up. It was during the 4th week that Caleb Walker appeared at the schoolhouse door on a Saturday morning with a bag of new nails, a replacement window latch, and a look on his face that said he'd come to work and not for conversation. Emily let him in. He spent 3 hours fixing the things Ruth had listed on that first day: the floorboards, the broken desk legs, a hinge on the supply closet that had been scraping badly since August. He worked steadily and quietly, and Emily graded papers at the front desk, and neither of them felt the need to perform ease because they had apparently, without planning, it arrived at the kind of company that doesn't require performance. Around noon, she made coffee on the small stove and set a cup near where he was working. He sat back on his heels, looked at it, picked it up. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for the latch," she said. "Where did you learn to do all this?" "The repairs." He drank some coffee, looked at the wall for a moment. "Growing up, mostly." "You grew up in the mountains." "Parts of me did." He said it simply without drama, but something in the phrasing caught her attention. "Parts of me," as though he was a man assembled from different places and different lessons and hadn't always lived the same life. "The Henderson family," she said, because it was what she'd been thinking about all morning. "Do you know them, Marcus and June?" He set the coffee cup down. "I know them. They lost their north pasture last week. Marcus signed something he didn't understand. Is there any recourse?" "Legally. I mean, is there anyone in Cedar Ridge who could look at the contract and tell him whether it was legitimate?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "Why are you asking me?" he said finally. "Because you fixed a wheel on a mountain road in a thunderstorm without being asked," Emily said. "And because when Tom Calloway mentioned your name at supper, the whole table went careful. I noticed that. And I think a man who makes a table of ranchers go careful is probably someone who knows more about this valley than he lets on." Something moved behind his eyes. Not alarm, not guilt. Something more like recognition. The same thing she'd felt that first night at the Calloway table. He was quiet for another moment. "I'll have a look at the contract," he said. Emily nodded. "That's all I'm asking." But she was already asking herself a different question entirely. Who exactly was this man sitting on her schoolhouse floor, drinking her coffee and fixing her broken furniture and making powerful people go quiet just by existing? She didn't have the answer yet. She didn't know how long the answer had been watching her. By the end of the 5th week, Emily's notebook had 12 pages of careful observations. Pruitt's lending patterns. The land classification changes coming out of Helena. The names that kept appearing on documents that displaced families. Gerald Pruitt, a lawyer in Billings named Aldous Crane, a land development company called Meridian Western Holdings, whose principal investors were, as far as she could trace through public records, entirely invisible. She had started spending evenings at the county clerk's office, a cramped, dusty room behind the sheriff's building, where the records keeper, a bespectacled young man named Elias, had taken a dim view of her initial inquiries, and a considerably warmer view after she helped him reorganize 3 years' worth of misfiled property deeds. She was not looking for anything she could prove yet. She was looking for the shape of it. Once you saw the shape of a scheme, the evidence had a way of finding you. On a Thursday evening in late August, bent over a ledger of land transfers from 1884 to 1887, she found something that made her sit back in her chair and stare at the ceiling for a full minute. 7 separate parcels, all small ranchers, all acquired through Meridian Western Holdings or entities connected to it, had originally been recorded under a single umbrella deed. A deed issued to a landowner whose name she recognized. Walker. She closed the ledger carefully, looked at the name again, opened it back up to make sure she hadn't misread. She hadn't. Caleb Walker had owned every single one of those parcels, and then he hadn't. She sat with that for a long time, turning it over in her mind before she finally blew out the lamp and walked back to the schoolhouse in the dark. She lay awake until 2 in the morning, thinking about a quiet man fixing broken desks and asking nothing in return, and about a ledger full of land that used to carry his name, and about Ruth Calloway's careful voice saying not every person here is what they look like on the surface. She had no idea yet which kind she was dealing with, better or considerably worse. But she was going to find out. She didn't ask him about the ledger, not right away. Emily Harper had grown up watching her father handle difficult things, a sick herd, a failed harvest, a neighbor who cheated on a fence line, and the lesson he repeated so often she'd stopped hearing it until she needed it was this: don't move until you know what you're moving toward. Asking Caleb Walker about 7 parcels of disappeared land before she understood the full shape of it would be like firing a rifle in the dark. You might hit something. You might hit the wrong thing entirely. So she watched. She kept her notebook. She kept her evenings with Elias at the county records office. And she kept her Saturday mornings in the schoolhouse, where Caleb Walker had developed what appeared to be a quiet, unannounced habit of showing up with tools. He didn't ask permission. He didn't announce himself. He simply arrived, assessed what needed doing, and did it. A cracked window frame one week, a warped door on the storage room the next. The kind of slow, attentive maintenance that a building needs and almost never gets, because the people responsible for it are always too busy with more urgent things. Emily watched him work and thought a man who owns land doesn't fix other people's broken windows. And then she thought, unless he used to own land and doesn't anymore. And then she stopped thinking about the ledger for a while and just handed him the coffee. It was easier that way. And she wasn't sure she wanted to know yet. Because the knowing would change things, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't want things to change. The Henderson situation broke open on a Monday. Marcus Henderson came to the schoolhouse before classes started, hat in his hands, with the particular hollowed-out look of a man who has not slept and has run out of options and knows both of those things. June Henderson waited outside with their youngest on her hip, watching the door. "Miss Harper," Marcus said, "Caleb Walker told me you might be willing to look at a contract." Emily put down her chalk. "Sit down, Marcus." He sat. He put the document on her desk. She read it twice carefully, slowly, and by the second reading her jaw was tight. The contract was for a 60-day grazing lease on the north pasture. Standard enough on its face. But buried in the third page in language that would have required a lawyer to catch on first read was a conversion clause, a provision that allowed Pruitt's lending office to convert the lease into a lien against the underlying property if any payment was missed or delayed by more than 5 days. Marcus had missed a payment in June. Not because he didn't have the money, because the payment collector hadn't come, and Marcus had assumed reasonably that it would roll to the following month. It hadn't rolled. It had converted. And the north pasture was gone. "This is predatory," Emily said. "Can it be undone?" She looked at him. His hands were shaking slightly on the table. Outside, June was rocking the baby back and forth, watching the door. "I don't know yet," Emily said, "but I'm going to find out." She made a copy of the contract in her own handwriting, every clause, every buried condition, and filed it in her notebook between her land transfer records and her notes on Pruitt's lending patterns. Then she walked the original back to Marcus, with both hands, looked him in the eye and said, "Don't sign anything else. Not a receipt, not a delivery notice, not a handshake agreement put to paper. Nothing. Not until someone you trust has read it first." He nodded. He looked like a man being thrown a rope and not yet sure if it would hold. That afternoon, without quite deciding to, Emily rode up the mountain road toward Caleb Walker's cabin. She hadn't been this far up before. The road narrowed past the fork he'd warned her about, stayed to the right as instructed, and climbed through a stretch of timber before opening onto a high meadow. The cabin sat at the far end of it, modest and well-built, with a split-rail fence and a lean-to shed that held 2 horses and various equipment in a state of careful organization. He was at the fence when she arrived, examining a section of broken rail, and he looked up with an expression that was entirely unsurprised, as though he had somehow known she was coming, or had learned long ago that being surprised was mostly a waste of energy. "Miss Harper," he said, "I need to talk to you about Marcus Henderson," she said, because she had decided on the ride up that she wasn't going to waste either of their time with pleasantries. "I read the contract, the conversion clause. Do you know what Pruitt is doing with those clauses?" Caleb set down the fence rail he'd been holding. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in the quality of his stillness. It went from the stillness of a man at rest to the stillness of a man paying close attention. "Tell me what you found," he said. She told him. All of it, the conversion clause, the missed collection, the 5-day window that had snapped shut on a family's 40 acres while they were waiting for a collector who never came. She watched his face while she talked. He listened the way very few people listen, without preparing his response while she was still speaking. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How many families?" he asked. "That I know of with similar contracts, 3, possibly 4. Margaret Sears has a lien document her husband supposedly signed that she has no memory of. Old Pete Garrow lost a grazing permit he'd held for 11 years. She paused. "And there are 7 land parcels in the county records that transferred through Meridian Western Holdings between 1884 and 1887. She watched him carefully when she said Meridian Western Holdings. Watched for the tell, the flicker, the tightening around the eyes that would tell her he recognized the name, or was afraid of it, or had reason to be. What she saw instead was something she hadn't expected. His jaw set. Quiet and hard, like a door closing on something he'd been carrying alone for a long time. "How did you find that?" he asked. "County records. Elias let me access the land transfer ledgers." She held his gaze. "Some of those parcels used to carry a different name, Caleb, before they went to Meridian." The silence that followed was different from his usual silences. This one had weight in it. "You're more thorough than I expected," he said finally. "I grew up watching my family's land disappear into paperwork," Emily said. "I know how to read a ledger." He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that it should have been uncomfortable, and somehow wasn't, and then said simply, "I'll look into Pruitt's collection records. There may be a way to challenge the Henderson conversion." "That's not an answer to my question." "No," he said. "It's not." He picked the fence rail back up and went back to work. And Emily, who had ridden up a mountain to demand answers, found herself riding back down with none, and inexplicably with the feeling that she trusted him more than she had before she'd asked. She couldn't explain that. She tried not to examine it too closely. October arrived and dried the grass gold on the mountain slopes, and Cedar Ridge moved into the particular rhythm of early autumn, the last of the harvest, the first serious firewood runs, the quiet anxiety of communities that run on thin margins, beginning to calculate whether they had enough to last the winter. Caleb was at the schoolhouse twice more in those weeks, but the work was finished by now, and so the visits shifted, became something else without either of them naming it. He would arrive in the late afternoon sometimes, when the last student had gone, and Emily would be at her desk, and they would talk for an hour about nothing that was urgent. The valley, the families, books she was using in class. He knew an unusual amount about an unusual number of things, not in the manner of a man who had studied, but in the manner of a man who had done, and Emily, who had an excellent ear for the difference, filed this observation carefully alongside all the others. He made her laugh. That was the part she hadn't anticipated. Underneath all that quiet reserve was a dry, precise wit, the kind that only surfaces in people who spend most of their time alone with their own thoughts. He said things that were exactly right, in a way that required both intelligence and honesty. And Emily, who had spent years around men who preferred to be impressive over being true, found this profoundly disarming. She was not naive enough to call it anything yet, but she was honest enough to acknowledge it was happening. The night everything shifted was a Wednesday in the second week of October. Emily had stayed late at the records office with Elias, and she was walking back to the schoolhouse in the dark when she heard the voices coming from the alley beside Pruitt's lending office. She should have kept walking. She knew in the rational part of her mind that processed danger correctly, that she should have kept walking. She didn't. She stopped. She stood in the shadow of the building across the lane and she listened. There were two voices. One was Pruitt's. She'd heard him enough times to recognize it. The other was smoother, more deliberate, the voice of a man accustomed to rooms where the final word was always his. "The Garrow permit is secure," the smooth voice said. "The Helena reclassification went through last week. Sears is manageable. The widow won't fight a document with her husband's name on it." "The Henderson situation is more complicated," Pruitt said. Walker looked at the contract. A pause. "Walker," said the smooth voice. Flat. Careful. "When did Walker start involving himself in Henderson's affairs?" "I don't know. But the teacher, the new one, she's been in the records office. Elias has been giving her access to the transfer ledgers." Another pause. Longer. "The teacher," the smooth voice said. Harper. "Yes, sir. Take care of the records access. Talk to the clerk." The voice hardened at its edges. "And find out exactly what Walker's interest in Harper is. Because if those two are comparing notes..." Emily didn't hear the rest. She had already pressed herself back into the shadow and was moving quickly and quietly in the opposite direction. Her heart was slamming against her ribs by the time she reached the schoolhouse. She sat at her desk in the dark and breathed and thought about the voice saying, "Find out what Walker's interest in Harper is." They were watching Caleb. They were watching her. And whoever the smooth-voiced man was, he wasn't afraid of Gerald Pruitt. Pruitt was afraid of him. She picked up her notebook. She wrote down every word she could remember. Then she sat for a long time thinking about Caleb Walker and those 7 parcels in the ledger, and the way his jaw had set when she'd said, "Meridian Western Holdings," like a door closing on something old. And she thought, he knows. He already knows about all of this. He has known for longer than I have. The question that kept her awake until 3 in the morning was not what Caleb knew. It was why, knowing everything he apparently knew, he hadn't done anything about it yet. She confronted him the next morning, not gently. She rode up the mountain before sunrise and she was at his fence when he came out of the cabin, and she did not let him get to pleasantries. "I heard Pruitt last night," she said, "in the alley beside his office. There was another man with him. I didn't see his face. They talked about the Garrow permit, the Sears, the Henderson contract. And they talked about you." Caleb had gone very still. "They know you looked at the Henderson contract," Emily said. "And they're asking questions about why you're involved. Which means you're already in this. You're already on their radar." She stepped closer. "So I need you to tell me what you know, Caleb. Not a part of it. All of it. Because I am not going to keep building this case with half the information, and neither of us is served by whatever you're protecting yourself from by staying quiet." He looked at her for a long time. The early light was thin and cold and honest, the kind of light that doesn't allow for comfortable distance. "I'm not protecting myself," he said. "Then what?" "I'm protecting the investigation." He said it quietly, precisely, like a man releasing something he'd been holding tightly for a long time. If Pruitt and his partners know someone is building a case against them before the case is complete, they'll move the assets, destroy the records, and be out of Montana before the territorial marshal has time to open an envelope. Emily stared at him. "You're building a case." "I've been building it for 2 years." The silence that followed that statement was the loudest thing Emily had heard since the bank auctioned off her father's land. "2 years," she said. "Yes. And you've been up here on this mountain, building it carefully," he said. "So it sticks. So it can't be dismissed or buried or bought away by lawyers." He held her gaze. "What you found in the ledger, the Meridian transfers, I have documentation, going back to 1882. Signed affidavits from families who were coerced. Original contracts with comparison signatures that prove the forgery. A paper trail that goes all the way to Helena and possibly further." Emily's mouth was dry. "Who are you?" she said. It came out quietly, without accusation, just the raw question that had been sitting underneath everything else for weeks. His expression shifted the smallest movement, something almost like relief and almost like grief wrapped together. "Right now," he said, "I'm the man who needs you to trust me for a little longer. Can you do that?" She thought about the way he'd fixed her wheel in a storm, the way he'd listened to Marcus Henderson, the way his jaw had set at Meridian's name, the way he showed up with nails and hinges and coffee and stayed until the work was done. "Yes," she said. "But don't ask me to stop looking. I wouldn't dare," he said. And for the first time since she'd known him, he smiled fully genuinely, and it rearranged his entire face into something that made her breath catch in a way she was not prepared for and could not immediately recover from. She rode back down the mountain in the early light, and she did not write anything in her notebook that morning. She just sat at her schoolhouse desk with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup and acknowledged plainly and without drama that she was in serious trouble. Not the kind Pruitt represented. The other kind. The kind with no ledger to organize it and no case to build toward resolution. The kind that just was, whether you were ready for it or not. The week that followed moved fast and quiet in the way that things move when something is gathering underneath the surface. Elias came to her on a Friday, pale and apologetic, and told her that Mr. Pruitt had been in to speak with the county administrator and that her access to the transfer ledgers was being reviewed. He pressed a folded paper into her hands before she left handwritten his own personal copies of 3 key transfer documents he'd made for himself months ago and hadn't known why until now. "I don't know what you're doing," Elias said, "but I know what Pruitt is. Be careful, Miss Harper." She tucked the papers into her notebook and thanked him and went straight to her desk and spent the entire evening cross-referencing his copies against her own notes. By midnight, she had found something new, a name she hadn't seen before in any of the documents. Not Pruitt, not Crane the Billings lawyer, not Meridian Western Holdings. A name above all of those. A name that appeared on a single document, a founding charter for Meridian Western Holdings from 1881, buried under layers of corporate restructuring that had been very deliberately designed to make it invisible. Victor Blackwood. She didn't know the name yet. She wrote it in her notebook and underlined it twice, and then sat very still for a moment, feeling the way you feel when you've found the center of something, the place everything else radiates from. She was going to need to tell Caleb. She was going to need to tell him tomorrow. She closed her notebook, blew out the lamp, and lay in the dark, listening to the wind off the mountain peaks, thinking about a man who had smiled at her for the first time that morning and rearranged something inside her chest she didn't know was still capable of being rearranged. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tonight, she would allow herself this one unguarded hour of feeling exactly what she felt. Tomorrow, everything would get harder. She rode up the mountain at first light with the name Victor Blackwood written in her notebook and a feeling in her chest like a storm front moving in the pressure of it, the electricity, the certainty that whatever was coming fast and could not be outrun. Caleb was already awake. He was always already awake. She had stopped being surprised by this. She had also stopped pretending even to herself that the way her pulse moved differently when she crested the ridge and saw the light in his cabin window was merely the effect of cold morning air. She handed him the notebook open to the page with Blackwood's name before she'd even dismounted fully. He read it. He went absolutely still. Not the careful stillness of a man thinking. The frozen stillness of a man who has just seen something he already knew was coming and had hoped against all evidence might not arrive quite yet. "You know this name," Emily said. "Yes." "Who is he?" Caleb handed the notebook back. He turned away from her for a moment, just a moment, and when he turned back, his expression had reorganized itself into something harder and more resolved than she'd seen on him before. "Victor Blackwood owns the largest cattle operation in 3 states, he said. He controls 2 banks in Helena, a rail freight company out of Billings, and approximately 40% of the commercial lending in this territory. He is the most politically connected man in Montana, and he has spent the last 6 years using Meridian Western Holdings as a shell to strip land from small ranchers and consolidate it under his own name through companies no one can easily trace back to him." Emily stared at him. "And you've known this for 2 years." "I've been documenting it for 2 years. Caleb." Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "If Blackwood is behind all of this, the Hendersons, the Garrows, the Sears, lean all of it, then he's not some local corrupt businessman. He's the man who took those 7 parcels," Caleb said quietly. "The ones you found in the ledger under my name." The morning went very quiet around them. "He took your land," Emily said. "He took my family's land, my father's land, original grants going back to 1869. He said it without heat, which somehow made it worse. The flatness of a man who has had a long time to compress his rage into something functional. He did it legally enough on the surface. Forged one signature on one document in 1881, used it to leverage a debt claim, and then restructured the ownership through Meridian so thoroughly that by the time I understood what had happened, the paper trail was buried under 4 layers of corporate transfers." He paused. "It took me 3 years just to find the original forged document. It took another 2 to build the supporting case. And now I have it. Almost all of it." His jaw set. "But Blackwood has lawyers in 3 cities and a territorial judge in Helena who owes him money. If I move before the case is airtight, he buries it and walks free, and every family who testified against him becomes a target." Emily looked at him for a long moment. Everything she thought she understood about Caleb Walker was reorganizing itself around this new architecture, the same man, the same quiet competence and careful honesty, but built on a foundation she hadn't seen before. A man who had lost what she had lost. A man who, instead of running from it, had spent 5 years turning grief into evidence. "What do you need to finish it?" she said. He looked at her with something that was not quite surprise, more like the expression of a person who had stopped expecting to be asked the right question and wasn't sure immediately how to receive it. "The founding charter you found," he said. "Blackwood's name on the Meridian document from 1881, combined with the affidavits I have and the transfer records that's the linchpin. That's what connects him directly to the scheme, instead of keeping him insulated behind Pruitt and Crane." "I have Elias's copies," Emily said, "and I have my own transcription. We'll need the originals from the county record. Elias gave me his personal copies. I think he'll testify to their accuracy." She paused. "Caleb, how long before we can move?" 2 weeks, he said. "Maybe 3. I need to contact the territorial marshal's office in Billings, a man named Holt who I trust, and I need to do it without Blackwood's people knowing." "Can you trust Holt? He's the only federal officer in the territory Blackwood hasn't gotten to." Emily nodded. She closed her notebook. She looked at Caleb Walker. This man she'd thought was a ranch hand. This man who had fixed her wagon and her floorboards and her broken window latch while quietly carrying a 5-year legal war in his chest. and she felt something so large and complicated move through her that she couldn't have named it with a single word. 2 weeks, she said. Then we end this. She rode back down the mountain before she could say anything else because there were several other things pressing at the inside of her ribs that had nothing to do with Victor Blackwood, and this was not the moment for them. She should have had 2 weeks. She got 9 days. On the 9th day, Gerald Pruitt walked into the schoolhouse at 3 p.m. with a document in his hand, and the particular expression of a man delivering bad news he is personally enjoying. Emily was erasing the board. She turned around when she heard the door and saw his face, and set the eraser down very deliberately on the chalk rail. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "school hours are over. This won't take long." He crossed to her desk, set the document on it without asking permission, and stepped back with his hands clasped in front of him. "The Cedar Ridge School Board met this morning. Emergency session. Given concerns that have been raised about your conduct and your unauthorized access to county records, the board has voted to suspend your teaching appointment pending review." Emily did not look at the document. She looked at Pruitt. "What concerns?" she said. Not a question, a demand for precision. "Accessing confidential lending records, interfering in private financial matters between the lending office and its clients, encouraging debtors to dispute legally binding contracts." He smoothed his lapel. "Miss Harper, you were hired to teach children reading and arithmetic, not to insert yourself into the financial affairs of this community." "I was looking at public land transfer records," Emily said. "Which are public. That's what public means, Mr. Pruitt." "The school board has made its decision." "Who sits on the school board?" He smiled. "Several of Cedar Ridge's most respected businessmen." "And how many of them have outstanding loans through your office?" The smile didn't waver. It didn't need to. He had already won this particular move, and they both knew it. "You have until Friday to vacate the schoolhouse," he said. "The board thanks you for your service." He left. Emily stood at the front of her empty classroom and looked at the neat rows of small desks. Marcus Henderson's daughter sat in the third one from the left front row. Pete Garrow's grandson in the back by the window, and she breathed through the anger until it settled into something she could actually use. Then she picked up her notebook, her personal copies of every document she'd accumulated over the past 6 weeks, and she walked out the door and rode straight up the mountain. Caleb met her at the fence before she'd finished dismounting. "I already heard," he said. "How Tom Calloway. His wife was in the general store when Pruitt told the storekeeper." He studied her face. "Are you all right?" "I'm furious," Emily said, "which means I'm thinking clearly." She handed him the notebook. "We don't have 2 weeks. They're accelerating. Pruitt losing the lending records access wasn't enough for them. They went after my position, which means they're afraid of what I already have." Caleb took the notebook. He didn't open it. He was looking at her instead. "Emily," he said, "if Blackwood decides you're a genuine threat rather than just a nuisance teacher, he won't stop at the school board. I know. The men he uses, they're not—" "I know," she said again, firmly. "Caleb, I lost my family's land to men like this. I watched my father sign papers he didn't understand because he trusted that legal documents meant what they said. I am not going to stand 30 miles away from Victor Blackwood and wait to be safe." She held his gaze. "So I need you to tell me how to help you finish this. Now, not in 2 weeks." He was quiet for a long moment. The wind was moving through the grass on the high meadow, and somewhere below them, a hawk was riding a thermal in long, patient circles. "I need to send a wire to Marshal Holt in Billings," he said finally. "But I can't send it from Cedar Ridge. Pruitt has a man at the telegraph office. I need someone to ride to Stillwater and send it from there." "I'll go." "It's a 4-hour ride." "I've ridden worse." She held out her hand. "Write the message." He looked at her hand. Then he went inside and came back with a folded piece of paper. "Memorize it before you send it," he said. "Don't carry it in your pocket the whole ride." She took the paper, read it again, handed it back. "Memorized," she said. He looked at her with that expression she'd come to know, the one that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite admiration, but lived somewhere between them in territory that had no road sign and no established name. "Be back before dark," he said. "I'm always back before dark," she said, which wasn't entirely true, but was the right thing to say, and they both knew it. She made Stillwater in 3.5 hours, sent the wire under the name Caleb had specified, not his own, a name she didn't recognize, but filed away carefully, and was back on the mountain road by 2 in the afternoon. She was 4 miles from the Cedar Ridge Fork when the two riders fell in behind her. She heard them before she saw them. The cadence of following hooves is different from the cadence of horses going somewhere, and she did not look back immediately. She kept her pace steady and used the next quarter mile to think. If she rode straight to Caleb's cabin, she led them directly to him. If she rode into town, she was alone among people who were either afraid or already aligned with Pruitt's interests. If she stopped, she stopped. She turned her horse sideways on the road, put her back to the hillside, and waited. They rode up and reined in 10 feet from her. Two men she'd seen before, not Pruitt's regular hands, harder looking than that, with the professional blankness of men paid to deliver messages that aren't the kind you put in writing. "Miss Harper," the nearer one said. "Mr. Pruitt would like to speak with you." "Mr. Pruitt knows where I live," Emily said. "He can come to me during civilized hours. He'd prefer now." "I'd prefer a great many things that aren't happening," Emily said. "Good afternoon." She kept her voice entirely level. Inside, her heart was running hard enough to make it difficult to breathe naturally. She kept her hands loose on the reins, her father's voice again surfacing from somewhere useful. A horse feels fear through the hands before the rider knows they're afraid. The second rider moved to her left. Not much, just enough. "We're going to need to insist," the first one said. "That would be a mistake," said a voice from the hillside above them. All three of them looked up. Caleb Walker was sitting on his gray horse at the top of the embankment, 15 feet above the road, entirely relaxed in the saddle. He had a rifle resting across his thighs, not aimed. Not threatening. Simply present the way Caleb himself was always present, quiet, unhurried, and absolutely unmistakable in what it meant. "Walker," the first rider said. His tone had changed. "Miss Harper was just heading back to town," Caleb said. "So were you, I expect." A long pause. The two riders looked at each other with the particular communication of men reassessing a situation. "Pruitt's going to hear about this," the first one said. "I expect he will," Caleb said pleasantly. "Ride safe." They left. Emily waited until the sound of their horses faded before she let herself breathe fully. "How long were you up there?" she said. "Long enough," Caleb said, riding down the embankment to the road level. "You followed me to Stillwater. I followed you to the fork, made sure you were clear, came back and picked up your return route." He looked at her steadily. "I told you to be back before dark. It was becoming dark." Emily looked at him. This man who had spent 5 years building a legal case in secret while fixing other people's broken things and asking for nothing, who had just sat on a hillside with a rifle across his knees and watched her rode home without her knowing and without making anything of it. "Thank you," she said, quietly, meaning considerably more than the words. He nodded once, meaning considerably more than the gesture. They rode back to Cedar Ridge together without speaking, and somehow said everything that needed saying. Marshal Holt's reply came 3 days later, not by wire, but in person. He rode into Cedar Ridge on a Thursday morning with 2 deputies and a leather satchel full of federal warrants, and he went directly to the office Caleb kept. Not the mountain cabin, Emily learned, but a proper office above the Cedar Ridge Bank that bore on a small brass plate she had somehow never noticed the name C. Walker Land and Property Holdings. She stood in the street, looking at that brass plate for a full 30 seconds before she went inside. The office was not the modest workspace of a ranch hand. It was the office of a man who ran something substantial. A large desk covered in organized papers, filing cabinets along one wall. A territorial map with notations she recognized now as land parcel boundaries, and Marshal Holt sitting across from Caleb with his satchel open between them. They both looked up when she came in. "Miss Harper," Marshal Holt said. He stood. He knew her name. Of course he knew her name. It was in Caleb's wire. "I understand you found the Meridian Charter." "I did," she said. She put the copies on the desk. "Elias at the county records office will verify the originals match." Holt looked at the papers. He looked at Caleb. "You have the affidavits." "Everything," Caleb said. "Then we move tomorrow morning." Holt closed his satchel. "I want both of you at the town hall at 9 o'clock. Blackwood is arriving in Cedar Ridge tonight, his quarterly inspection of the local operations." Something cold entered his voice. He won't be leaving on his own schedule. Emily looked at Caleb. He was already looking at her. "Tonight," she said. "Tonight," he confirmed. And then, because the moment required it, and she was done pretending moments didn't require things, she said, "Caleb, before tomorrow, I need to know. The land, the 7 parcels. Is that what this has always been about for you?" He looked at her steadily. "It's what started it. And now—" A long pause. The kind that Caleb used not to avoid answers, but to make sure the answer he gave was the true one. "Now it's about every family in this valley who deserves to sleep without wondering if they'll still own their land in the morning." He held her gaze. "And it's about making sure the woman who rode to Stillwater alone to send a wire for me doesn't have to run from another valley for the rest of her life." Emily Harper, who had not cried since the day the bank auctioned her father's land, felt her throat close with something she refused to call tears in front of Marshal Holt and 2 federal deputies. She picked up her notebook. She put it in her bag. She walked to the door. 9 o'clock, she said without turning around. "I'll be there." She walked out into the Cedar Ridge street, and the autumn light was doing something unreasonable with the mountains, and somewhere across town, a man named Victor Blackwood was riding in to inspect his holdings and had no idea that everything he had built on stolen ground was going to come down around him tomorrow morning. Emily took one long breath of cold air and let herself feel for exactly 1 moment something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Ready. She didn't sleep. She lay in the narrow bed behind the schoolhouse partition and stared at the ceiling and listened to Cedar Ridge settle into its nighttime quiet. The distant sound of the saloon, a dog barking twice and going silent, the wind working its way down from the peaks, and she ran through everything in her mind, the way she always ran through things methodically, looking for the gap, the thing she'd missed, the place the plan came apart. She couldn't find one. That frightened her more than finding one would have. A case without visible holes was either airtight or had a hole you couldn't see yet. At 4 in the morning, she gave up on sleep-dressed, made coffee, and sat at her desk with her notebook open to a blank page. She didn't write anything. She just sat with the open page the way you sit with something you don't yet have words for. And she thought about Caleb Walker's office above the bank with the brass plate on the door, and about how many times she had walked past that building in 6 weeks and seen exactly what she expected to see, a bank, a street, ordinary Cedar Ridge, and not looked up. Not every person here is what they look like on the surface. Ruth Calloway had said that on the very first night. Emily had filed it away as general frontier wisdom. It had been a specific warning about a specific man, and she had missed it completely. She closed the notebook. She thought tomorrow everything changes. Then she corrected herself. Today. It was already today. The town hall of Cedar Ridge was a single large room above the feed store, reached by an exterior staircase that creaked on every 3rd step. By 8:45 in the morning, it held more people than it had probably ever held at once. Ranching families, storekeepers, the widow Sears, with her hands folded in her lap. Marcus and June Henderson in the back row with their youngest, asleep against June's shoulder. Old Pete Garrow standing along the wall because there weren't enough chairs. Ruth Calloway in the 2nd row with Tom, who had not been told everything, but had been told enough to know he needed to be present. Emily sat in the front row beside Marshal Holt's 2 deputies. She had her leather satchel on her lap. She had not seen Caleb since the previous afternoon, and she did not turn around to look for him, though she was aware of his absence, the way you're aware of a missing tooth, a specific, localized alertness that you can't quite make yourself stop noticing. Gerald Pruitt came in at 8:50 with Aldous Crane, the Billings lawyer, and two men Emily recognized as Blackwood's personal staff from the descriptions Caleb had given her. They took seats on the opposite side of the room with the ease of men who believe they are attending a meeting they have already won. Pruitt saw Emily, and his expression did something complicated, not quite alarm, but a recalculation. He had expected her to be gone by now. She had been suspended. Her records access revoked, her position eliminated. She was supposed to be on a stagecoach back to Cheyenne, another inconvenient woman successfully redirected. She met his eyes and did not look away. He looked away first. Victor Blackwood came in at 8:58. Emily had built a picture of him from fragments. The smooth voice in the alley. The name at the bottom of a founding charter, the architecture of 6 years of methodical theft. She had expected something outwardly monstrous. What she got was a man of about 60, silver-haired, well-dressed, with the particular bearing of someone accustomed to entering rooms and having them reorganize around him. He was charming-looking. That was the most disturbing thing about him. He had the face of a man who sat on church boards and donated to school funds and remembered the names of people's children. He surveyed the room with the brief proprietary glance of a man checking that his property is in order, and then he stopped. He had seen something at the back of the room that changed his expression. Emily turned around. Caleb Walker was standing at the back wall with Marshall Holt. The meeting was called to order by the county administrator, a nervous man named Briggs, who clearly had not been told everything about why he was there and was beginning to suspect the morning was not going to go as he'd assumed. Blackwood remained standing. He was looking at Caleb with the particular focus of a man recalibrating a situation. "Walker," he said, not a greeting, a statement of recognition between men who have a history. "Victor," Caleb said. Same tone. The room heard the flatness of it, no title, no courtesy, and felt something shift in the air. "I wasn't aware you'd be attending," Blackwood said. "I expect there's a lot about this morning you weren't aware of," Caleb said. Marshall Holt stepped forward. He identified himself Federal Marshal Territorial Jurisdiction, and the room went so quiet, Emily could hear Pete Garrow breathing from the wall. "Victor Clarence Blackwood," Holt said. "I have federal warrants for your arrest on charges including land fraud, forgery, coercion, and conspiracy to defraud property owners in Cedar Ridge and Stillwater counties. I also have warrants for Gerald Pruitt and Aldous Crane." The silence lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then Blackwood laughed. It was a controlled, dismissive sound, the laugh of a man who has had lawyers neutralize federal warrants before and has no particular reason to believe this time is different. "Marshall," he said, "I'd advise you to consult with my legal team before you embarrass yourself any further. Whatever case you think you have is built on the Meridian Western Holdings founding charter of 1881, Emily said. Every head in the room turned to her. She stood up. She had not planned to do this, or rather she had planned to be a witness, a supporting presence, the woman who found the documents. But Blackwood's laugh had done something to her composure that she wasn't prepared to tolerate sitting down. "Your name is on it," she said. "Victor Clarence Blackwood, Principal Investor, Founding Member, the same charter that established the shell company you used to acquire land from 17 families in this valley through forged contracts and fraudulent debt instruments." She opened her satchel. "I have copies. The originals are with the county records keeper who will testify to their authenticity." Blackwood looked at her. His expression had changed, not to alarm, not yet, but to the particular attention of a predator who has just realized the small animal it was ignoring has teeth. "Who are you?" he said. "Emily Harper," she said. "I was the school teacher. Your associate, Mr. Pruitt, had me dismissed last week." She paused. "I've had a productive week since then." Aldous Crane was on his feet. "This is highly irregular. Any documents this woman claims to have obtained through unauthorized records access are inadmissible." "The records are public county documents," Marshall Holt said flatly. "Accessed legally through the county records office by a private citizen. Counsel, sit down." Crane did not sit down. He moved toward the door. One of Holt's deputies was already there. Crane sat down. What happened in the next 40 minutes was the most compressed, devastating piece of legal deconstruction Emily had ever witnessed. Caleb Walker, standing at the front of the room with the quiet authority of a man on his own ground, walked through 6 years of documented evidence with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment in his mind so many times it had worn a smooth groove straight to the truth. He was not a ranch hand. He was not a modest mountain cowboy scraping out a living on the high range. He was the sole owner and principal of Cedar Ridge Valley Holdings, the legitimate heir to land grants covering more than 40,000 acres across 3 counties. A man who had sat on the boards of 2 territorial banks before removing himself deliberately to investigate their connection to Meridian Western Holdings, without the conflict of interest that board membership would have created. He had hidden all of this. For 2 years in Cedar Ridge specifically, and for longer in the wider territory, he had moved through the community as an ordinary man, because he had known, and the evidence bore this out, that ordinary men saw things that powerful men were carefully never shown. He saw Blackwood's operation clearly, because Blackwood had never considered him a threat. As Caleb spoke, Emily watched the faces in the room. Tom Calloway's expression cycling through surprise and recognition, and something that might have been sheepishness. He had known Caleb longer than anyone, and had apparently guarded the secret with the loyalty of a man who understood its stakes. Ruth Calloway, with her eyes bright and her hands very still in her lap. Marcus Henderson, gripping June's hand. The widow Sears, pressing 2 fingers to her lips. And Blackwood. She kept returning to Blackwood. He was no longer laughing. He was no longer performing ease. He was watching Caleb with the expression of a man who has just realized that the game he thought he was winning was played on a board he never saw clearly, and that the man across from him had been watching every move from the beginning. The Henderson conversion clause, Caleb said, is void on its face because the payment collection was deliberately withheld. I have testimony from the collector himself, who has agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced liability. He set a document on the table. The Sears lien is a forgery comparison analysis of Robert Sears's authentic signatures against the document Pruitt presented shows inconsistencies in 7 distinct letter formations. Another document. The Garrow permit revocation was initiated by a letter to the Helena Land Office, signed by a Meridian Western Holdings representative, a company that as of this morning I have demonstrated to Marshal Holt's satisfaction is wholly controlled by Victor Blackwood. He kept going, document by document, family by family, year by year. It was not theatrical. It was not performed for effect. It was simply the truth organized and delivered by a man who had carried it long enough and was now methodically setting it down in the place where it could do the most good. Emily realized watching him that this was who Caleb Walker had always been in the schoolhouse, with the nails on the mountain road in the storm at the Calloway supper table, listening to what wasn't being said. Not a man playing a role. A man who had found in the act of helping people when power wasn't watching the only way he knew to keep faith with himself while he waited for the moment he could do something that actually lasted. Blackwood broke at the 40-minute mark, not dramatically, not with a confession or a scene. He simply turned to Aldous Crane and said very quietly, "Get me out of here." And Crane said equally quietly, "I can't." And something in Blackwood's bearing the whole engineered structure of authority and confidence and $50 suits deflated by about a 1/4 inch. Just enough to see through it to what was underneath, which turned out to be a frightened old man who had built his entire life on the assumption that he was the one who decided when things ended. Marshal Holt arrested him formally. Then Pruitt. Then Crane. The room exhaled like a held breath finally released. And then something happened that Emily hadn't anticipated, and that broke something open in her chest that had been sealed shut since the day the bank auctioned her father's land. Marcus Henderson stood up. He was shaking slightly. He looked at Caleb, and then he looked at the floor, and then he looked at the room, and said in the voice of a man finding his way to words from a long distance, "My family came to Cedar Ridge 2 years ago. We lost 40 acres last month. We thought—" He stopped. swallowed, started again. We thought that was just how things worked, that people like us didn't win. He looked back at Caleb. Thank you. It was inadequate. He knew it was inadequate. The room knew it. But inadequate honest gratitude is worth more than eloquent performance, and the room understood that too, because the silence that followed was the warm kind, the kind that holds people together rather than separating them. Then Pete Garrow said, 11 years I had that permit. 11 years. He shook his head slowly. 11 years. And Margaret Sears said nothing. She pressed her handkerchief to her eyes and cried quietly with the dignity of a woman who has been afraid for a very long time, and is only now in a room full of witnesses allowing herself to believe it might be over. Emily found Caleb afterward outside on the stairs alone. The room behind them was still buzzing with the particular electricity of people processing the fact that the thing they had accepted as fixed and permanent had just moved. She stopped on the step below him. They were eye level this time, which felt right. You should have told me sooner, she said. Not with anger, just truth. I know, he said, not about Blackwood, about you. She held his gaze. About what you were actually doing and why. I could have helped more. You helped exactly enough, he said. The charter, the Stillwater wire, standing up in that room this morning when He stopped, looked at her steadily. When I needed someone else in that room who understood what this was actually about, not just the land, not just the legal case. He paused. I needed someone who knew why it mattered. Emily thought about her father's land, about the Hendersons, about Margaret Sears crying with her handkerchief. I know why it matters, she said. I know you do, he said. That's why I trust you. It was a simple sentence. He said it simply, and it landed with more weight than anything anyone had said to her in longer than she could easily calculate. She looked at this man, this complicated, deeply private, unexpectedly tender man, who had spent 5 years being underestimated on purpose, and had used every minute of it for something good, and she said, what happens now? Now Holt takes Blackwood to Billings for federal processing. The territorial court will appoint receivers to manage the Meridian assets during the unwinding. The land transfers go into review. Every parcel acquired through Meridian after 1881 will be examined. He considered. It'll take months, maybe a year, but the Henderson pasture will come back. Garrow's permit will be reinstated. Sears will have the lien voided. He paused. It works. The case is complete. And the 7 parcels, she asked. Your family's land. He was quiet for a moment. That's not why I did it, he said. I know, Emily said. That's not what I asked. He looked at her, and this time the expression she couldn't previously name resolved itself into something entirely clear. Something that had been building since a mountain road in a thunderstorm, since coffee in a schoolhouse, since a ridge above a road where she'd thought she was riding home alone and hadn't been. I don't particularly care about the land anymore, he said. The land was what I started with. It's not what matters to me now. Emily Harper, who had arrived in Cedar Ridge 6 weeks ago with a worn suitcase and the practiced self-sufficiency of a woman who had learned not to need things. She couldn't guarantee, stood on the steps of the Cedar Ridge Town Hall in the October light and felt the last of something hard and long held in her chest begin very quietly to give. Don't make that statement unless you mean it, she said. I never say things I don't mean, he said. You know that by now. She did know that. It might have been the first thing she'd known for certain about Caleb Walker before she'd known anything else. All right, she said. Just that. But in the way she said it steadily, without performance, without deflection. She meant, I hear you. I'm not running. I'm still here. He nodded, meaning the same in return. Behind them, the room was beginning to empty Cedar Ridge, filing back out into its own streets to begin making sense of what had happened. Below them in the lane, Marshal Holt was speaking to his deputies. Somewhere across town, a bell was ringing, the school bell Emily realized out of habit, because it was 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning, and for the past 6 weeks, 10 o'clock on a Thursday meant school. She listened to it ring. She thought about 11 empty desks and broken legs repaired, and a window latch that worked now, and about the small, serious faces of children who had been waiting 14 months for someone to take them seriously. "I don't have a job," she said. "The school board suspended me." "The school board," Caleb said, "is about to have some significant vacancies." She almost laughed. "You can't just install a new school board." "The principal investor in the Cedar Ridge Community Trust," he said with the mild precision of a man stating a documented fact, "has the authority to call for a board review under the Community Charter of 1879. He paused. "I looked it up." Emily looked at him. "When did you look it up?" "Last week," he said. "After Pruitt suspended you." She stood with that for a moment. A man who had been in the middle of a 5-year legal case against the most powerful man in the territory had found time in the middle of all of it to look up the charter provisions for reversing the dismissal of one school teacher. She didn't know what to do with that, so she did the only honest thing. "Thank you," she said, quietly, meaning considerably more than the words. He touched the brim of his hat, that minimum gesture, the same one from the mountain road 6 weeks ago, the night they'd met. Except this time, he didn't right away. He stayed exactly where he was, and so did she. The days after Blackwood's arrest moved the way. Days move after a long illness, finally break slow. At first, tentative people testing the air to see if it was actually safe to breathe normally again. Cedar Ridge didn't celebrate loudly. These were not loud people. What they did was quieter and more lasting than celebration. They went back to their land, their fences, their morning routines, and they did it with the particular steadiness of people who have just been reminded that the ground beneath their feet is actually theirs. Emily watched it happen from the schoolhouse steps, where she had reinstated herself the morning after the town hall meeting, without waiting for formal board approval, on the practical grounds that 11 children needed a teacher, and the board's authority was at present somewhat in question. Nobody came to stop her. She took that as permission. The first week was paperwork and process. Marshall Holt's deputies working out of the town hall, going through Pruitt's records box by box, affidavit by affidavit, building the formal federal case that would move Blackwood through the territorial courts. Caleb spent most of those days in his office above the bank, which Emily now understood had been his real headquarters all along. The cabin on the mountain was where he lived. But the office above the bank was where the work had happened, quiet and invisible, for 2 years. She stopped by on a Wednesday afternoon with coffee and found him at his desk, surrounded by land transfer documents, cross-referencing Holt's inventory against his own records with the same focused patience she'd watched him apply to a broken wagon wheel in a thunderstorm. He looked up when she came in. His expression did the thing it had started doing, the slight opening, the drop of the usual guardedness that she was still getting used to, and suspected she would be getting used to for a long time. "Sit down," he said. She sat. She set one cup in front of him and kept the other. "How many families?" she asked. 17 confirmed, possibly 3 more once Holt finishes the Pruitt records. He set down his pen. "The Henderson North pasture is already in process. The conversion clause has been formally voided. The documentation is with the territorial court. Should be restored within 30 days. And Garrow's permit. Helena Land Office received the correction filing yesterday. Pete will have it back by end of month." Emily curled both hands around her cup. Outside the bank window, she knew without looking, because she'd walked past it every day for 6 weeks, and knew exactly what was out there. Cedar Ridge was doing its ordinary afternoon things. Wagons, horses, the sound of the feed store taking a delivery. Ordinary, unhurried, real. "What about the Sears lien?" she asked. "Voided," he said. "Pruitt has agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentencing. One of the things he's given them is the full documentation of the forgery process, who forged the signatures whose instruction they were acting under." He paused. "Margaret Sears will receive a written apology from the territorial court." "A written apology," Emily repeated. "I know," he said. "It's inadequate." "It's something," she said. "She'll frame it." He almost smiled. She probably will. They sat for a moment in the particular comfortable quiet that had become the texture of their time together. Not silence born of having nothing to say, but the kind that exists between people who have said enough important things that the unimportant ones don't need to fill the space. Then Emily said, "There's something I need to tell you." He looked at her. "I had a letter this morning," she said. "From the school district office in Cheyenne. There's a position. A proper one-district supervisor of schools covering 4 counties. Salary housing, the kind of role that—" She stopped. Organized herself. "The kind of role I applied for 2 years ago before everything fell apart. Before the land, before Cheyenne. They've offered it to me." The room was very quiet. "When did this come?" he asked. "This morning's post." He was looking at her with that quality of attention she had learned to recognize as his version of the most serious engagement he was capable of completely, still completely present, reading not just her words, but the things she was not yet saying. "And?" he said. "And I haven't responded," she said. "I wanted to tell you first." Another silence. This one had more weight in it. "Emily," he said carefully. "That position is everything I worked toward before Cedar Ridge," she said. "Yes, I know." She met his eyes. "I also know that 6 weeks ago I came to this town to disappear into purpose and stop expecting things from people. And something got in the way of that plan." "Something," he said. "Someone," she corrected. Quietly, without looking away. Caleb Walker, who chose his words with the precision of a man who understood their exact weight, was quiet for a long moment. "I'm not going to ask you to stay," he said finally. "I wouldn't do that." "I know you wouldn't," she said. "That's not what I'm asking you." "Then what are you asking me?" She set her cup down, looked at him plainly. "I'm asking you whether there's a reason to stay that I haven't found yet," she said. "Because I've found quite a few already. 11 students who finally have a teacher who takes them seriously. 17 families who are getting their land back. A valley that's going to need time and people and steadiness to rebuild." She paused. "And a man who fixes broken things on mountain roads in thunderstorms and doesn't tell anyone about it afterward." Caleb looked at her for a long, steady moment. "That man," he said slowly, "has been trying to find the right time to say something to you for approximately 4 weeks, and has concluded that there is no right time and he has simply been afraid of the wrong answer." Emily's breath caught. "Say it now," she said. "I don't want you to take the Cheyenne position," he said. "Not because Cedar Ridge needs you, though it does. Not because of the school or the families or the valley." He held her gaze without deflection. "Because I need you. In a way, I haven't needed anyone in longer than I can easily account for. And I'm aware that's a complicated thing to say to a woman who came here to be independent of exactly that kind of need." Emily looked at him. This man who had been the most powerful person in 3 counties and had spent 2 years pretending to be no one in particular, who had fixed her floorboards and followed her home through the dark and looked up school board charter provisions in the middle of a federal case because someone had suspended her job. "It's not complicated," she said. "No. No." She picked her cup back up, settled back in the chair with the ease of someone who has made a decision and feels the rightness of it in her bones. "I'll write to Cheyenne tomorrow." Something moved across his face. Relief, and something deeper and older than relief, the expression of a man who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just been told plainly and without condition that he doesn't have to anymore. "Emily," he said. "Don't make it a production," she said. "Just, I'm staying, that's all." He nodded once, meaning everything. October became November, and the case moved through the territorial court with the momentum of something long overdue. The twist that Cedar Ridge had not anticipated, that even Caleb had not fully anticipated, arrived on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of November, when Marshal Holt rode back into town with a document that changed the scope of everything. Emily was at the schoolhouse when Caleb came to get her. She took one look at his face and put her chalk down. What happened? Blackwood's attorneys filed a motion this morning to have the Meridian Charter declared fraudulent on the grounds that it was itself forged, Caleb said. They're arguing that Blackwood's signature on the founding document was placed there without his knowledge, that someone used his name to establish the company, and he has been an unwitting figurehead. Emily stared at him. That's a lie, Caleb said flatly. A very sophisticated, very expensive lie that his legal team has clearly been constructing since the arrest. If it succeeds, it removes the direct link between Blackwood and the fraud. Pruitt becomes the principal, Crane becomes the executor, and Blackwood walks out of a federal courtroom as a victim. Can it succeed? She said. It has a chance, he said. Unless we can demonstrate that Blackwood had direct operational control of Meridian decisions, not just his name on the charter proof that he was directing the land acquisitions personally. Emily was already thinking, already moving back through everything she knew. The collection records, she said. Pruitt's collection records that Holt's deputies pulled from the lending office. Pruitt told me in the alley that night he said, "Yes, sir," to the smooth-voiced man. He was reporting to someone. Those records, does anyone have Pruitt's internal correspondence? Caleb looked at her sharply. What correspondence? Pruitt kept a ledger, not the public lending records, a separate one. Green cover kept in the bottom drawer of his desk behind the filing box. I saw it once when I was in his office arguing about my records access. He put his hand on it, this specific deliberate gesture, the way you put your hand on something you don't want anyone looking at. She held Caleb's eyes. If that ledger has communication records between Pruitt and Blackwood, direct instructions, operational decisions. Caleb was already at the door. Come with me, he said. Holt's deputies had boxed Pruitt's records, but had not yet completed the full inventory. The green ledger was found exactly where Emily said it would be at 11:47 in the morning, still in the bottom drawer behind the filing box. Emily stood at Holt's shoulder while he read it. It was not a lending record. It was a communication log, dates, summaries of instructions received, and in several instances, verbatim transcriptions of directives that Pruitt had apparently recorded for his own protection in the manner of a man who knew he was doing something that could one day be turned against him and wanted insurance. The directives were specific. They named parcels. They named families. They specified timing method, and in 3 instances, the exact language to use in the forged documents to make them difficult to challenge. They were signed at the bottom of each entry with a single initial. B. That's not enough, Caleb said. 1 initial. Page 43, Emily said. She had been reading over Holt's other shoulder. Pruitt wrote out the full name. Just once the entry from March 1885, the Garrow permit instruction. He wrote the name in full. Holt turned to page 43. He read it. His jaw tightened. Victor Blackwood, he said, directing the reclassification of Garrow's permit, in Pruitt's own handwriting. The room went very quiet. That's direct operational control, Caleb said. That's conspiracy with documented instruction, Holt said. He closed the ledger carefully. Blackwood's motion is dead. Emily stood very still and felt the particular sensation of watching something that deserved to fall, finally completely fall. Blackwood was convicted by the Territorial Court in Billings on the 14th of December, 1887. The conviction covered land fraud, forgery, coercion, and conspiracy, 17 counts across 2 counties. Pruitt received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation. Crane was disbarred and convicted on 3 counts of document fraud. The Territorial Court appointed receivers to manage the Meridian assets, and the unwinding process began slower than justice, as it always is, but moving in the right direction. And unlike so many things in Cedar Ridge's recent history, impossible to stop. Marcus Henderson got his north pasture back on the 22nd of December. He rode Emily out to see it on a gray winter morning and stood at the fence line and didn't say anything for a long time. June came out with the youngest on her hip, and they all stood there together in the cold and looked at the land, and Marcus Henderson said very quietly, "My grandfather broke this kind of ground. Never thought I'd—" and stopped. Emily put her hand on the fence post beside his, and didn't fill the silence because it didn't need filling. Pete Garrow received his grazing permit reinstatement by mail and showed up at the schoolhouse to tell Emily personally, as though she were family, which she was beginning to understand was how Cedar Ridge had quietly decided to regard her. Margaret Sears received her written apology from the territorial court. She did frame it. Emily saw it on her parlor wall on a Sunday afternoon in January, and felt something so full and complicated in her chest that she couldn't have named it with anything less than the whole story. The school board was restructured in January, as Caleb had promised under the community charter provision. 3 new members were appointed, none of them with outstanding loans to Pruitt's office. Emily's position was formally reinstated with a written apology of its own, briefer and considerably less elegant than the court's, but genuine, offered by a man named Webb, who had voted for her dismissal and had the decency to be ashamed of it. She was given a small budget for new books and a larger one for repairs. The first thing she spent the repair budget on was the north end roof. Caleb came to help with the actual work the same way he'd come to fix the floorboards and the window latch unannounced on a Saturday morning with tools and without ceremony. He brought Tom Calloway and Marcus Henderson, and the 4 of them spent a day on that roof while Emily ran the school's first lending library operation from the front steps cataloging donated books from 7 different families. Ruth Calloway brought lunch at noon and looked at Emily with those tired eyes that weren't quite as tired anymore and said, "You stayed." "I stayed," Emily confirmed. Ruth looked at Caleb on the roof, looked back at Emily, said nothing more because some things are better honored by not being said aloud. The evening that changed everything between them, the last thing that needed changing, was in February, when winter was deep and the mountain creek had gone quiet under ice, and Cedar Ridge was the particular kind of still that only January and February can produce in a mountain town. They had taken to walking in the evenings when the weather allowed it, not the creek path, yet still too icy, but the road that ran between the schoolhouse and the feed store, and back a modest circuit that had become, without either of them formally deciding it, the place where they said the things that the rest of the day didn't leave room for. Caleb had been quieter than usual for 3 days. Emily had noticed and had waited because she had learned that pressing Caleb Walker produced nothing useful and patience produced everything. "I owe you something," he said on the 3rd evening. Emily looked at him. "You don't." "I do." He walked for a moment without speaking. "When I decided to come to Cedar Ridge to stay here to work the case from inside the community, instead of from a lawyer's office in Helena, I told myself it was strategy. That being among ordinary people being seen as ordinary was the most effective way to build the case without alerting Blackwood's network." He paused. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. She waited. "The truth is, I was tired," he said. "Not of the work, of being the man who owned things, of rooms where people treated me differently because of what was attached to my name." He stopped walking, turned to her. "I came up to this mountain because I wanted to know what it felt like to be just a man. And what I found, what I didn't expect, was that being just a man made it possible for me to see what actually mattered." He held her gaze. "You, what you were doing, what you were risking, what you were. None of that had anything to do with who I was or what I owned. You saw me before you knew any of it." Emily stood in the winter dark, looking at this man who had been the most powerful person in 3 states, and had chosen deliberately to set all of it down so he could see clearly, and had found in the clarity something he hadn't gone looking for. "I saw a man who fixed things," she said, "who showed up when it mattered and didn't ask to be thanked for it." She paused. "That's who you are, Caleb. The rest of it, the land, the holdings, the name on the brass plate, that's what you have. It's not the same." He looked at her for a long, still moment. "Marry me," he said. It was not a speech. It was not arranged. It had none of the ceremony that a man of his resources could certainly have produced. It was simply a direct statement from a man who had spent his entire adult life learning to say exactly what he meant and mean exactly what he said. Emily Harper, who had arrived in Cedar Ridge with a worn suitcase and a practiced armor of self-sufficiency and the absolute conviction that she did not need anyone's land or name or protection, stood in the winter dark on a mountain road and felt every last piece of that armor do what well-made things eventually do when they're no longer needed: lay down. "Yes," she said. No ceremony in that either. Just the word plain and complete offered by a woman who had learned that the bravest thing was not to survive alone, but to choose with full knowledge of the cost not to. They married in March when the mountain creek thawed and Cedar Ridge came back into itself after winter, with the particular energy of a community that has survived something and knows it. The whole valley came. The Callaways. The Hendersons with their youngest in a new dress June had made herself. Old Pete Garrow in his good hat. Margaret Sears with her framed apology on her wall at home and tears on her face in the church. Elias the records keeper, who had pressed documents into Emily's hands when it mattered and had asked for nothing, and received in return the particular satisfaction of having been on the right side of a story that ended correctly. Emily wore a dress the color of the late winter sky. Not white, not elaborate. The dress of a woman who knows herself well enough to know what suits her, and she stood beside Caleb Walker in front of the whole of Cedar Ridge and made a promise she made with every part of herself, not a single part held back. Caleb, who had stood in that same town hall 4 months ago and dismantled a 6-year empire of fraud with organized evidence and a quiet voice, stood beside her and shook. Just slightly, just enough for her to feel it when she took his hand. She held it tighter. He steadied. The woman who had arrived in Cedar Ridge with nothing but a suitcase and a wound that hadn't finished healing did not end up with wealth. She ended up with something wealth could not have bought her, and could not replace a community that called her family a purpose, that grew every time a child in her schoolhouse understood something new, a man who had chosen to be known by her before he was known by anyone else. And Caleb Walker, who had owned more land than most men would see in a lifetime, who had carried a 5-year case against the most powerful man in the territory alone, and in silence discovered in the end what he had actually been building toward all along. Not the conviction, not the restored parcels, not the brass plate on the office door. The woman who had looked at him on a mountain road in a thunderstorm and handed him tools without being asked, who had ridden to Stillwater alone to send a wire for a man she barely knew but had already decided to trust, who had stood up in a crowded room and said, "Your name is on it to the most dangerous man in 3 states," without her voice shaking once. That was what he had been building toward. He just hadn't known it until she arrived. Cedar Ridge kept its land, its families kept their ranches, its children kept their teacher. And the most powerful man in the mountains finally understood that the only thing worth having was the one thing that could never be put on a deed: someone who saw you clearly and stayed anyway.